The story of this crime begins not with a missing person or a call to the police, but with a quiet laboratory report. In the conclusion of the National Laboratory of Iceland, there was one dry scientific phrase: "The presence of human myoglobin and albumin has been detected." Simply put, human proteins. What made this finding shocking was where the experts obtained the sample. It was scraped from the bottom of a large pot that the police had seized from a kitchen in an ordinary apartment in the town of Ísafjörður. From this moment on, terror had a specific address, but the pot was only part of the overall picture. During the search of the same kitchen, the attention of forensic experts was drawn to a simple household freezer. A special reagent, luminol, illuminated washed-away blood traces on its inner walls. Subsequent DNA analysis confirmed the worst fears. The blood belonged to 27-year-old Sigga, who at that time was listed as missing. It became obvious to the investigators that they were dealing with an attempt to hide the body in the most brutal way. The totality of the findings indicated dismemberment. The apartment where all this took place belonged to 29-year-old Eline, a worker at the local fish processing plant. When the police began to examine her surroundings, they stumbled upon a detail that was incomprehensible. The deceased Sigga, whose traces were found in the freezer, was not just an acquaintance. By all accounts, she was her best friend. Thus, the investigation faced a new, much more complex task. They had to understand not who did it, but how a quarrel between two best friends in a snow-covered town could lead to such an end. To understand what led to this tragedy, one needs to look more closely at who these two women were in their ordinary lives before it was shattered. Let's start with Sigga. At 27, she was a person with a clear plan for the future. Like many in Ísafjörður, she worked at a fish processing plant. Monotonous, hard labor on an assembly line, which she viewed as a temporary stage. Her real goal was hundreds of kilometers away, in Reykjavik. This was not just a dream. Sigga had already corresponded with her cousin in the capital, saved money for a down payment on a small apartment, and was actively collecting documents for transfer. Acquaintances described her as a purposeful and focused girl who knew what she wanted. Her life was following a completely clear and stable script, and next to her was her best friend, 29-year-old Eline. But her world was the complete opposite of stability. Her entire life revolved around her 7-year-old son, Mikael, whom she was raising alone. In a small town where everyone knows everyone, her financial difficulties were an open secret. Constant attempts to make ends meet, overdue bills, and debts created enormous pressure. And shortly before the events, this pressure reached its peak. Eline received an official letter from social services. This was not just a formality, but the first step in an official procedure. The letter spoke of opening a case to verify the child's living conditions and an imminent visit from an inspector. For Eline, this was an alarm signal, meaning she was under close state scrutiny. And at this point, the stories of the two friends collide. During the investigation, one of their mutual colleagues at the plant will give key testimony. She will recount that a few days before Sigga's disappearance, she looked anxious but determined, and mentioned in conversation that she was preparing some papers for an official body. At the time, no one paid much attention to this. But the investigation found that social services began their check after an anonymous complaint. And to continue the case, they lacked the testimony of a witness who could confirm facts of parental neglect. Sigga was going to be that witness. For Eline, this meant one thing. Her best friend was going to give official testimony that could be the final step towards her son being taken away. So on one side of the scale was Eline's threat of losing her son, and on the other, Sigga's determination to testify. This underlying conflict was bound to resolve itself. And the chronology of events of that fateful evening becomes key to understanding what happened next. On February 8th, 2016, at 1840, Sigga finished her shift at the fish processing plant. At this time, the approaching storm had already begun to show its character. The wind intensified, thick snow fell. Instead of going home, she headed in the opposite direction. Billing data from her mobile operator shows that at 1910, her phone connected to a cell tower that served Hafnerstraße Street. The cell tower covered a small area, and in the center of that area was the house where Eline lived. This was the last time Sigga's phone emitted a signal, and it was the last place her presence was recorded. Immediately after this, an information vacuum begins in the case. After 1910, Sigga's phone disappears from the network. It could have run out of battery, it could have been turned off, or it could have been destroyed. In any case, it went silent. And on that same evening, the isolation of the small town intensified manifold. According to utility data, at approximately 21:30, due to a power line break, the entire area plunged into darkness. There was no light until 23:45. No streetlights, no lights in the windows that could illuminate what was happening. Thus, a blind spot formed in the case. A time interval of almost 2.5 hours, when there was no light or working cell service in the house on Hafnerstraße. These were ideal conditions to hide anything. Several days passed. By February 12th, the storm finally began to subside. Snow removal equipment cleared the roads, and Ísafjörður regained connection with the rest of the world. Life was returning to normal, and it was against the backdrop of this returning normalcy that Sigga's absence became apparent. First, her workplace became concerned. She was a conscientious employee and never missed shifts without warning. Then her family from Reykjavik became alarmed. At first, they attributed it to communication problems after the storm. But when 24 hours passed and there was still no news from Sigga, they contacted the police. From that moment, a missing person case was officially opened and the investigation began. From the moment the missing person report was filed, the investigation began to gain momentum. The first and most logical step for the police was to follow up on Sigga's last documented location, the residential building on Hafnerstraße Street. Police officers began a methodical door-to-door inquiry, trying to find anyone who might have seen or heard anything unusual on the evening of February 8th. However, this work almost immediately reached a dead end. The town was just recovering from the storm, and most residents gave the same answer. Due to the deafening howl of the wind and the drumming of snow against the windows, they heard nothing happening outside their apartments. But just as hope for a lead was almost exhausted, one of the residents, an elderly man from the first floor, provided testimony that sharply differed from all the others. His words were recorded with extreme precision in the protocol. He stated that on that night, when the electricity in the area was cut off, he woke up to a strange noise in the stairwell. According to him, it was not the sound of footsteps or voices. It was a dull, scraping sound, as if someone was slowly rolling or dragging something very heavy across the floor. He did not attach importance to it then, attributing it to a neighbor moving furniture. But two clarifications he gave immediately attracted the attention of the investigation. Firstly, the time. It happened precisely during the interval when the house was completely without power. Secondly, the nature of the sound. It was intermittent, as if a heavy object was being dragged with difficulty through doorways. This testimony became the first and only evidence that penetrated the information vacuum of that night. It was this testimony that made investigators re-examine another seemingly insignificant finding. A few days earlier, a patrol had found a discarded coil of thick nylon rope near the commercial pier. Standard rope, hundreds of which were used at the fish processing plant for binding boxes. On its own, this rope was not evidence. And on its own, the sound in the stairwell was merely strange. But when investigators placed these two facts side by side, the disparate details coalesced into a single picture. A hypothesis was born instantly. What if the heavy object the neighbor heard was a standard fishing crate, large enough to contain a person? And what if the very rope from the plant was used for its transportation? This version perfectly connected the place, time, and method of possible body movement. The hypothesis instantly became the main working theory. From this moment, Eline's apartment ceased to be just Sigur's last known location. It became the presumed crime scene. But in any investigation, before focusing on one version, it is necessary to examine and rule out all others. Standard procedure required the police to study Sigur's immediate circle of acquaintances, her last contacts, and any possible conflicts. And it was during this routine check that a new name appeared in the case files: Einar, Sigur's ex-boyfriend. Initially, this was just a formality, but very soon investigators realized that they might have a completely different version of events on their hands. Einar was a fisherman from a local trawler, and as interviews with acquaintances revealed, his breakup with Sigur was not smooth. Moreover, just a few days before her disappearance, they had a public quarrel in the town's only bar. Witnesses confirmed that money was involved. Thus, the investigation had an alternative suspect, a person with an obvious motive and an unpredictable character. Suspicions regarding Einar began to look even more serious when investigators gained access to Sigur's bank accounts. Examining the statements for the last week, they discovered a transaction that perfectly fit the version of a quarrel over money. It was a money transfer to Einar's account, made just 2 days before her disappearance. The amount was not round, and the payment description simply stated, "personal." To the police, this looked like significant evidence. It could have been a debt repayment under pressure. It could have been payment for silence. In any case, this transfer indicated that some tense financial dealings were taking place between them right before the tragedy. For a while, the focus of the investigation shifted. The version involving Einar looked simple, logical, and had documentary confirmation. But a good investigator always checks the facts twice. And when the police began to check Einar's alibi, this entire plausible version crumbled in an instant. The first step was to send an inquiry to the shipowner whose trawler Einar worked on. Modern fishing vessels are equipped with satellite trackers and maintain detailed logbooks. The data was irrefutable. On the evening of February 8th, when Sigur disappeared, and for the subsequent 2 days, Einar's trawler was fishing 70 kilometers offshore. His alibi was 100% solid. When he was summoned for questioning about the money transfer, he calmly provided a receipt. It turned out he had sold Sigur a used boat engine, and she had simply transferred the remaining amount to him. The amount on the receipt matched the transfer amount down to the last krona. All suspicions were cleared from Einar, and this sharp turn meant only one thing. The only alternative lead turned out to be false, and now all the investigation's attention, with renewed intensity, returned to the only remaining location, Eline's apartment on Hafnarstræti Street. After the only alternative lead hit a dead end, all threads of the investigation once again converged on Eline's apartment. Now the police needed to obtain her official version of events from that evening. Eline was summoned for her first official interrogation. She behaved calmly, appeared concerned about her friend's fate, and cooperated fully with the investigation. When asked to reconstruct the chronology of the night of February 8th to 9th, she gave a clear and concise answer. In an excerpt from the protocol, her testimony reads, "All night from February 8th to 9th, I was at home with my son." She added a detail that was meant to give her words absolute credibility. "We didn't go out because of the storm. It was too dangerous." It was a simple and logical alibi, almost impossible to refute. The picture she painted was absolutely plausible. A mother and child waiting out a storm in a locked house. But while Eline was building her defense, investigators were simultaneously engaged in routine, but extremely important work, analyzing Sigur's financial activity. And it was there that they stumbled upon a detail that completely destroyed Eline's alibi. According to banking data, on February 9th at 00:20 at night, Sigur's debit card was used. The purchase was made at the 24-hour bonus store, the only one open that night. The police immediately requested surveillance camera footage. The video quality was low, but it clearly showed a figure in a deeply pulled-down hood paying at the checkout. This figure was buying a strange assortment for a night visit: several packs of candles, bread, and a pack of cereal. When forensic experts conducted a biometric comparison, they concluded the height and general build of the person in the recording, with a high degree of probability, matched Eline's physical data. At this point, the investigation had two absolutely contradictory facts in its hands. On one side, Eline's official testimony, in which she swore that she spent the entire night confined at home with her son. On the other side, a camera recording and a bank transaction that showed a person very similar to her, using her missing friend's card in the middle of the night, immediately after the electricity was restored in the area. This contradiction was direct and irrefutable. It could not be attributed to error or coincidence. The very first serious check of her words showed that she was lying. From this moment, Eline's status in the case changed dramatically. She ceased to be merely a witness. Now she was the main suspect. Now that Eline was the main suspect, the investigation's task was to fully reconstruct her actions on the night Sigurd disappeared. The police understood that her story about being at home was a lie, and they needed to reconstruct her actual whereabouts minute by minute. In a region with complex geography, where towns are connected by tunnels, road cameras play a crucial role. Investigators requested data from the only camera monitoring the exit from Ísafjörður. This camera was installed at the entrance to the road tunnel leading to the neighboring fishing village of Hnífsdalur. The location was extremely important to the case. It was there, near the pier in Hnífsdalur, that a patrol had found the very coil of nylon rope from the fish processing plant a few days earlier. Previously, it was just a finding. Now it was a key location. Reviewing the recordings for the night of February 8th to 9th yielded an immediate result, which was another blow to Eline's version. In the first recording, time-stamped 01:10 at night, the camera clearly captured a small Suzuki Jimny SUV belonging to Eline. The license plate was perfectly legible. The car was moving towards the tunnel leading to Hnífsdalur. This already completely contradicted her alibi. But what investigators saw next turned suspicion into certainty. Fast-forwarding the recording, they found a second passage. At 02:25 at night, the exact same car was again captured by the camera, moving in the same direction. Two trips to the same small village, in the middle of the night, during the height of the strongest storm. Absolutely nothing was operating in Hnífsdalur at that time. These movements had no logical domestic explanation. Now the picture for the investigators became crystal clear. Eline's alibi of being at home had already been refuted by her trip to the store with Sigur's card. Now it was refuted twice by irrefutable data from the road camera, which connected her to a key location where evidence had previously been found. The lie was not an isolated incident, but a system. Her story fell apart. The police came to an unambiguous conclusion. All of Eline's documented actions that night, the trip to the store for candles, the two trips to the remote pier, were not accidental. They were part of a single process, and this process could only have one goal: to conceal the traces of a serious crime. Now that the investigation had a clear picture of Eline's movements, they realized that her lie was not just a panicked reaction, but a carefully crafted story. To utterly destroy this story, they needed direct, physical evidence linking her to the crime. The police returned to the witnesses who had seen the hooded figure in the bonus store. During a second interrogation, the cashier, after some thought, added a detail he hadn't considered important before. He recalled that when the figure turned to leave, the collar and shoulder of a jacket were briefly visible under the hood. They were bright red. For a small town, this was an important detail. Many residents, including colleagues from the plant, confirmed Sigga had a distinctive red parka that she wore almost all winter. This jacket was her calling card. Now the police had not just a theory, but a specific target. Based on all the collected evidence, a false alibi, the use of a bank card, and nighttime trips, they obtained a warrant to search Eline's apartment with the goal of finding one specific item: Sigga's red parka. The search began. Investigators methodically examined every corner of the apartment, and their search was successful. Deep inside the wardrobe, under a pile of old clothes, they discovered what they were looking for: that very red parka. When the evidence was presented to Eline, she showed neither surprise nor panic. She had an answer ready. In the interrogation protocol, her explanation was recorded as follows: Sigga left it at my place a few weeks ago. Forgot it after we went to visit together. The version sounded plausible. Best friends often exchange clothes. There was nothing unusual about that. But words are one thing, and facts are quite another. The police packed the parka in a sealed bag and immediately sent it for full forensic examination. Now, science was to provide the answer to whether Eline was lying this time. And science provided an answer that left Eline's version in tatters. The examination delivered results in stages, and each new fact was like a hammer blow. Result number 1. Upon inspection of the collar under ultraviolet light, several human hairs were discovered. Result number 2. DNA analysis showed that the hairs were 100% Eline's. This proved that she wore her friend's jacket, but did not yet prove when exactly. The final third result of the examination was decisive. Forensic experts discovered microparticles of technical salt on the hem of the parka. Chemical analysis showed that the composition of this salt was completely identical to the de-icing agent that Ísafjörður's utility services used that very week to treat the steps near building entrances. This was irrefutable evidence. Science confirmed that Eline did not just wear Sigga's parka. She wore it outdoors, on the night of the crime. The scientific confirmation that Eline wore her missing friend's parka on the night of the crime became a turning point. Now the police had every reason to consider her apartment not just a place where the suspect built a false alibi, but a full-fledged crime scene. During the same search, when the parka was found, investigators also seized other items that might be relevant to the case. In the official protocol, they were listed dryly and routinely: household freezer, white, 120 liters in volume; large steel pot; 2 blue plastic crates, standard for fish processing. These were ordinary household items that could be found in any home in Ísafjörður. Forensic experts were given a cold and clear task: to conduct a detailed analysis of these items for any micro traces of biological material. All seized items were carefully sealed and sent from the small town to the capital, to the National Laboratory in Reykjavik. In the sterile conditions of the laboratory, these ordinary objects began to reveal their terrible secrets. The freezer was the first object of investigation. Experts treated its inner walls with luminol, a chemical compound that glows upon contact with traces of hemoglobin. In the darkened room, the walls, which seemed perfectly clean, flared with an eerie bluish light. The chemical reaction indicated that there were extensive traces of blood here, which someone had tried to carefully wash away but failed to remove completely. Samples taken from these spots were immediately sent for genetic analysis. The result was unambiguous. The DNA profile completely matched Sigga's DNA profile. Now the freezer in Eline's house was officially linked to the missing girl. But the most shocking discovery awaited the experts. They proceeded to examine the large steel pot, the very one seized from the stove in Eline's kitchen. Microscopic scrapings of material, invisible to the naked eye, were taken from its bottom. To identify its composition, experts used one of the most accurate methods in modern forensics: mass spectrometry. which allows the precise protein compounds in a sample to be determined. The result of this analysis was recorded in the laboratory conclusion, Volume 2, and it reads, "The submitted sample shows the presence of human myoglobin and albumin. In simple terms, human protein was found at the bottom of the pot in which Eline cooked food." The findings made at the National Laboratory were irrefutable and horrifying. They proved that what occurred in Eline's apartment was not merely a tragedy, but a whole series of cold-blooded and gruesome acts to conceal a crime. However, the investigation faced a new, purely practical question. Could Eline, acting alone, have managed all this? Moving heavy crates, disposing of evidence, covering her tracks in different parts of the town. All of this required physical effort and time. Logic suggested that she might have had an accomplice. Examining her contacts and checking port personnel where she had traveled that night, the police came across one name, Kjartan, a security guard who was on duty that shift. Further investigation revealed that he had a minor but documented conflict with Eline over parking at the factory a month earlier. Most importantly, he had keys to all service rooms and warehouses at the pier, as well as access to industrial waste containers. Theoretically, he was an ideal candidate for an accomplice. Investigators immediately called Kjartan in for questioning. He did not deny a minor conflict with Eline, but categorically stated that he had nothing to do with the case. When asked what he was doing on the night of February 8th to 9th, he replied that almost his entire shift was dedicated to resolving an emergency. A storm wind had damaged one of the loading ramps, and he was busy repairing it. The police did not take his word for it. An official request was made to the port administration. Examination of the duty log and call records fully confirmed his words. There was a clear entry in the log. Call to emergency ramp number 3, time of recording, 22:40. According to the notes, work on site continued until late at night, precisely at the time Eline was making her trips. Kjartan's alibi seemed convincing, but to close this version definitively, the investigation took a final step. Kjartan's work gloves, which he wore on duty that night, were seized. If he had helped move boxes or a body, microscopic traces might have remained on them. The gloves were sent to the same laboratory in Reykjavik. The result of the examination was prosaic and conclusive. Traces of organic matter were indeed found on the gloves. It was fish scales and remnants of lubricating oil. No traces of blood or other human biological materials were found. Kjartan was completely and unconditionally excluded from the case. This final stage of the investigation cut off the last side avenue. There were no more what-ifs. There was no ex-boyfriend, no mysterious accomplice. All roads led back to the apartment on Hafnastrati, and it was now clear everything that happened there, Eline did alone. The realization that Eline acted alone only added to the horror of the overall crime picture. Now that all side tangents had been cut off, the investigation moved to its final stage, building an absolutely airtight case for the court, one with no weak points. This meant rechecking every detail, every movement, every expenditure of the suspect. It was during this total review of Eline's financial data that investigators stumbled upon the last suspicious lead. Her bank statements recorded an outgoing transfer made on the morning of February 9th. The amount, 30,000 krona. The recipient, a girl named Asa, who, it turned out, sometimes worked as a nanny and looked after Eline's son Mikael. In the context of the entire case, this transfer looked extremely suspicious. It was made immediately after the night of the crime. The investigation immediately formed a theory. This was payment for silence. Perhaps the nanny was in the apartment that evening, saw or heard something, and Eline was trying to buy her loyalty. Asa was immediately summoned for questioning. The girl was scared and utterly bewildered as to what connection she could possibly have to Siggy's disappearance. When she was shown the transfer details and asked what the money was for, her explanation was utterly simple and mundane. She calmly took out her notebook in which she kept track of working hours and showed it to the investigators. According to her records, in January she had babysat Mikhail several times while Eline was on extra shifts at the factory. 30,000 kroner was the standard payment for her services for the previous month. She claimed that Eline always paid her in the first days of the month, and this payment was nothing unusual. Now the investigation had two versions. On the one hand, suspicion of witness tampering, and on the other, routine payment for services. Asa's words had to be verified documentarily. To put an end to this matter, the investigation requested Eline's bank statements not for a week, but for the past 6 months. Analysts began to study her entire financial transaction history, and very soon they found what they were looking for. The statements for each month, December, November, October, showed a transaction to Asa's account in the first days of the month. The amounts varied slightly, but were always within 25 to 35,000 kroner, which corresponded to different numbers of hours worked. This was a clear, repeating pattern. The payment on the 9th of February was not an anomaly, it was part of a routine. The version of bribery was completely refuted. This last check was extremely important. It showed that the investigation had worked through absolutely all possible versions, even the most unlikely ones. Now there were no more blank spots in the case, no other names or suspicious transactions. Only irrefutable physical evidence against Eline remained. Now that the investigation had no unanswered questions and no unverified versions left, the game was over. All the accumulated evidence, witness testimonies, camera data, bank statements, and most importantly, forensic examination conclusions, was systematized and ready for presentation. Eline was brought to the police station for a final official interrogation. The atmosphere was completely different. This was not a conversation or an interview, but a formal procedure. In the room, in addition to the investigators, a state-provided lawyer was present. Before the interrogation began, all her rights were officially read to her. At this moment, her status in the case changed for the last time, and this was recorded in the protocol. From the main suspect, she became the sole accused in the murder case. The wall of denial that Eline had built for so long now had to confront irrefutable facts. The investigator methodically, point by point, began to lay out the collected evidence, and each new fact was a direct blow to her version. The first question concerned her night trips. Why was your car recorded twice in one night by the camera near the tunnel leading to Hnifsdala? Her answer was short. I don't remember. Next came the question about the financial side of the matter. Why did you use Siggy's debit card at the store if you claimed you didn't leave the house? Here she tried to find an explanation. She allowed me. She gave me the PIN code. This version was weak and illogical, but she was still trying to defend herself. The tension in the room grew. The investigator moved on to physical evidence. How did Siggy's blood, confirmed by DNA analysis, get into your home freezer? And here her defense finally collapsed. She was silent for a long time and then quietly said, I don't know. The investigator paused and then silently placed a thin folder with the emblem of the National Laboratory on the table. This was that very report. Conclusion number 2. He did not ask a question. He simply opened the last page and slowly, distinctly read aloud a single line that was the culmination of this entire investigation. Human protein was found in samples taken from the bottom of a pot seized from your home. A heavy silence hung in the room. This was not just an accusation. It was a statement of an unthinkable fact against which no arguments existed. Eline lowered her eyes and did not utter another word. In the official interrogation protocol, this moment was recorded in dry, formal words. The suspect refuses to answer further questions. The suspect remains silent. Eline's silence in the interrogation room was more eloquent than any words. To the investigation, her guilt was obvious. But now a new stage began: preparation for trial. Prosecutors needed not just to prove that she did it, but to build such an ironclad chain of evidence that the defense would have no loopholes. This meant that every piece of evidence had to be re-examined with a clear head to understand not only what happened, but also how. As part of this preparation, investigators once again turned their attention to 2 blue plastic boxes seized from Eline's apartment. Previously, they were considered simply as possible containers for moving remains. But one meticulous forensic expert noticed a small, barely visible burnt serial number on the rim of each box and decided to check its origin. At the fish factory, they confirmed this was their quality control system. Each batch of boxes has a unique number that is linked to a specific date, shift, and production line. Suddenly, anonymous boxes turned into traceable objects. This bureaucratic detail opened up a new opportunity for the investigation. Investigators immediately went to the factory with the numbers taken from the boxes in Eline's apartment and requested the logbooks. Together with the shift supervisor, they began to reconcile the figures. The search in the production log took no more than 15 minutes and led to a stunning result. The serial numbers on Eline's boxes matched a batch that was produced and put into circulation during her last work shift on the 8th of February, just a few hours before Siggy's disappearance. This finding completely ruled out any randomness. These were not old boxes that had been stored in her home for a long time. This proved that she personally took this specific container from the production line on her last working day. Now the prosecution had in hand a final, irrefutable argument that countered the most likely line of defense: the version of a spontaneous crime committed in a fit of passion. The logical chain aligned perfectly. Fact number 1. On the afternoon of the 8th of February, Eline purposefully took large containers from the factory perfectly suited for concealing evidence. Fact number 2. On the evening of the same day, a crime occurred in her apartment, and at night her car traveled twice to a remote pier, a convenient place to dispose of these very boxes. By connecting these 2 facts, the investigation proved a sequence. First, the preparation of the tool for concealment, and then the concealment itself. The version of sudden panic and ill-considered actions collapsed. The concealment, at the very least, was planned. Now that the evidence pointed not only to the crime itself, but also to an element of preparation for concealment, the defense's position became extremely vulnerable. Understanding that complete denial in the face of such evidence was impossible, Eline's lawyer made an official statement that was intended to be their main line in court. It was a partial admission, presented as a tragic accident. According to this version, a quarrel indeed occurred between Eline and Siggy on the evening of the 8th of February. During the conflict, as the defense claimed, Eline pushed her friend. Siggy, losing her balance, fell and unfortunately hit her head on the corner of furniture. Death was instantaneous. All subsequent gruesome actions, attempts to dispose of the body, lying to the investigation, using the card, the defense explained by one thing: a state of affect and panic fear. According to them, Eline, realizing that her best friend was dead and fearing that social services would immediately take her son from her, lost her mind and began to act irrationally. This version was the defense's only chance to mitigate guilt, presenting Eline not as a cold-blooded criminal, but as a victim of circumstances driven to despair. But the prosecution had a scientific and irrefutable answer to this. During the pre-trial hearings, the prosecutor read out key findings from the forensic medical examination report. The document spoke not of one, but of multiple injuries found on the remains. But the main thing was one cold formulation. Some of these injuries showed signs of being antemortem. In forensics, this term means that the injuries were inflicted while the person was still alive, and the body had time to react to them. This scientific conclusion completely destroyed the version of a single accidental fall. Based on this and all other collected evidence, the prosecution formulated its final, official version of events, which formed the basis of the case. According to the investigation, a verbal quarrel between Eline and Siggy escalated into a physical struggle, which was indicated by multiple antemortem injuries. Siggy's death did not result from an accidental fall, but from deliberate, violent actions by Eline. Everything that happened afterward was classified by the prosecution as separate, conscious actions. The subsequent dismemberment and attempt to destroy the remains were not an act of panic. These were cold-blooded and methodical steps, proving intent and a firm intention to conceal the committed crime at any cost. Now that the court had two versions, a tragic accident from the defense and a cold-blooded crime from the prosecution, the prosecutor presented a final, step-by-step reconstruction of events, based solely on collected facts and evidence. This reconstruction pieced together all the disparate details into a unified and terrifying picture. It all began on the evening of the 8th of February at approximately 7:10. At this time, according to cell phone data, Siggy entered Eline's apartment on Hafnarstrati Street. Between this moment and 21:30, when the power went out in the area, a conflict occurred between the two friends, which, according to the investigation, escalated into a physical struggle and ended with Siggy's death. It was the sudden power outage, plunging the entire area into darkness, that gave Eline not only cover but also time to act. It was during this period of darkness and silence, broken only by the howling storm, that the neighbor on the first floor heard something heavy being dragged across the floor. According to the reconstruction, Eline used the very boxes she had taken from the factory in advance to move the remains from the apartment to her car. After that, the camera documented logistics of concealment began. At 1:10 at night and again at 2:25, her car made 2 trips to the pier in Hnífsdalur. The plan apparently was to drown the boxes in the raging sea, allowing the storm to permanently hide the evidence. But it was here that the elements, which had been her cover, turned against her. Due to the incredible force of the storm and huge waves, she failed to carry out her plan completely. The plan failed, and Eline was forced to bring part of the dreadful cargo back to her apartment. Returning home, she faced the need to hide what she could not get rid of. It was then, according to the investigation, that the home freezer came into play, where traces of Siggy's blood were later found. This was a temporary solution. The final and most monstrous act of this story was a desperate attempt to destroy the remaining evidence through heat treatment. This explained the presence of human protein at the bottom of the kitchen pot. In this chain of events, there is a grim irony. The storm, which seemed to be the perfect cover for the crime, ultimately became the reason for its unraveling. It prevented Eline from getting rid of all the evidence, and to top it all off, washed ashore near the pier the very coil of rope that became the police's first clue leading to this location. Now that all the evidence had been presented and all versions articulated, the case moved into its final stage, the trial. And it was in the courtroom that perhaps the most terrifying and poignant testimonies in this case were heard. These were not the words of experts or investigators. The judge read excerpts from 7-year-old Mikhail's conversation with a child psychologist. The boy, of course, was not a witness to the crime and did not understand what had happened. He simply answered questions about what he remembered from those days when the storm raged. His answers were childlike in their simplicity, and all the more chilling because of it. He did not speak of any quarrel or struggle. He recalled mundane details. Mom cooked a lot of soup. The house smelled strange. But the most powerful moment in this testimony was one short phrase that he repeated several times. When asked by the psychologist about his mother's mood, he replied, "She cried a lot." After this, the parties proceeded to the closing arguments. The defense adhered to its version to the very end. The lawyer asked the court for leniency, painting a picture of a tragic accident. He insisted that Siggy's death was unintentional, and all of Eline's subsequent actions were committed in a state of affect caused by a panicked fear of losing her only child. The prosecution, in turn, was unyielding. The prosecutor methodically listed all the evidence pointing to premeditation and cold-bloodedness, the pre-prepared boxes, the lies during interrogations, and, of course, the conclusions of the forensic expert and laboratory analyses. They demanded the maximum penalty, not only for intentional murder, but also for the subsequent desecration of the deceased's body. After hearing both sides, the court retired to deliver its verdict. On the 2nd of September 2016, the final verdict was announced in the Reykjavik District Court. Eline, standing before the judge, did not utter a word. She was found guilty on all counts. The court completely rejected the defense's version of a state of affect, deeming the evidence of deliberate concealment of the crime irrefutable. The sentence was harsh: 20 years of imprisonment. But there was one more point in the court's decision that became the final touch in this story, and the most terrible irony of fate. Eline was completely stripped of her parental rights. Her desperate and cruel attempt not to lose her son led to her losing him forever. The verdict brought a legal end to the case, but the human story shattered by this tragedy continued. Eline was transferred to serve her 20-year sentence in Iceland's only women's prison. Her son, 7-year-old Mikael, was permanently removed from her custody. Social services placed the boy with his biological father's relatives, and he left Ísafjörður to start a new life away from the places associated with this trauma. Thus, the family that Eline so desperately and terribly tried to protect ultimately ceased to exist precisely because of her actions. The consequences of this story rippled throughout the town. For the small closed community of Ísafjörður, where everyone knows everyone, this case became a deep collective trauma. This was not a crime committed by a stranger. It grew from within. During the investigation and trial, neighbors, factory colleagues, and mutual acquaintances had to testify effectively against each other, which brought division and distrust into the community. The story of two best friends, ending so terribly, turned into a grim local legend. A cautionary tale about what horror can hide behind the doors of a neighboring apartment. Ultimately, the investigation and court were able to reconstruct almost the entire picture of what happened with incredible accuracy. All the facts of the crime, and especially its subsequent concealment, were established and proven. We know about the boxes, the trips to the pier, the red parka, and the dreadful finds in the freezer and pot. But the only thing that will forever remain a mystery is the exact sequence of events and words spoken in the first minutes of the quarrel in the apartment on Hafnarstræti. Since Eline never gave full confessions, and the only witness is dead, we will never know exactly what was the final straw. The line between a spontaneous, tragic outburst of anger and a cold, conscious decision remained there forever, in the darkness of the house enveloped by a snowstorm. Cold, absolute darkness, and the monotonous sound of dripping water. When Inez came to, she realized she was at the bottom of an old stone well, chest deep in icy water. Above her, just a tiny sliver of the night sky obscured by a rusty grate and a heavy pallet. A trap. At night, she heard the roar of an engine. Hope, number, terror. It was them. Returned to finish what they had started. Muffled voices could be heard from above. Then a liquid with the pungent smell of chlorine was poured down. It burned her skin, corroded her eyes and throat. Every breath became agony. Above, they apparently thought the job was done and drove away, leaving her to die in the suffocating fumes and icy water. But they were wrong. 2 days later, at dawn on the 20th of October 2020, a bread delivery driver named João was on his usual route to the small town of Montfort. On the roadside at the edge of a field, he noticed a strange figure. As he approached, he braked sharply. A girl lay in the wet grass. barefoot in dirty rags with bluish skin from the cold and whitish patches of chemical burns on her face and hands. She was unconscious, but she was breathing. João immediately dialed 112. At the district hospital in Porto Alegre, she was quickly identified. It was 17-year-old Inês S., who had been missing for 3 days. The medical protocol was short and terrifying. Severe hypothermia, damage to her vocal cords, chemical burns to her skin and respiratory tract. A police officer was already waiting outside her hospital room for her to be able to give a statement. A few hours later, in a semi-conscious state, Inês came to. She couldn't speak. Her throat was burned. But with her last strength, she croaked a few fragmented sentences which the police officer feverishly scribbled into his notebook. These words became the starting point of the entire investigation. White van, strong smell, diesel and cloves. The license plate, I think. 56 UH. On the same day, the police initiated proceedings for kidnapping and attempted murder. Finding a white Ford Transit in a rural area is an almost impossible task. There are hundreds of such vehicles here. But the investigators had a unique clue: the barely perceptible smell of clove tobacco, firmly imprinted in the victim's memory. They did not yet suspect that this thread led not to a random madman on a country road, but to a man Inês knew all too well. To understand who would want to harm this girl, the investigators had to return to her world. Rewind the film by 48 hours, to the moment when Inés's life was still proceeding in its usual, predictable course. And this film was found in the archive of a surveillance camera installed above the staff entrance of the São Bento bakery. The image is black and white, somewhat grainy. In the corner of the screen, the date glows: 17th of October 2020, a Saturday. Time: 20 hours, 31 minutes. The door opens, and the same girl steps onto the street. But here she is different, healthy, calm, with a slight tiredness on her face after a work shift. She adjusts her backpack, puts on headphones, and pushes out her old bicycle. For a moment she stops, quickly types something into her phone, smiles at her thoughts, and pushes off with her foot to ride through the gate. The camera loses sight of her as she turns onto a dimly lit country road. This was the last image that captured Inés's former life. Inés S., 17 years old. A final year student at the local school in Montfort, a small, quiet town where everyone knows everyone. The school characterization was short and concise: responsible, determined, non-confrontational. She was not a party animal, but neither was she a timid outcast. She had a small circle of friends, plans to study at the university in Évora, and the dream of eventually moving to Lisbon from there. To help her family and save for the future, she had taken a part-time job at the São Bento bakery, where she baked bread and cleaned up in the evenings. Everyone who knew her, teachers, colleagues, neighbors, described her in the same way: a quiet, polite girl who simply lived her life. She lived a few kilometers from the bakery, and this bicycle ride was a familiar ritual for her. 15 minutes on a familiar road, past olive groves and small farms. A route she had traveled hundreds of times, and that seemed to pose no danger. Exactly this moment, 20 hours, 31 minutes, Saturday, the 17th of October, became the starting point for the police. The second Inés S. was last seen safe, alone with her music and her thoughts. From this image, she disappeared from the radar. Now, investigators had to reconstruct every meter of her short, but as it turned out, deadly dangerous journey home. And this journey home ended abruptly and quickly, just a few hundred meters from the bakery gate. As the police searched her route, they found the first and most important piece of evidence. On the gravel strip at the roadside, barely visible in the dark, lay her bicycle. The chain hung limply from the sprocket, a common, annoying breakdown that could have happened to anyone. It was this small detail, this coincidence that made her vulnerable. Next to the bicycle, forensic experts noted something else. Deep, clear tire tracks, indicating a heavy vehicle. The tread and the skid mark on the gravel suggested that the vehicle did not simply pass by. It had stopped sharply right there, next to the lonely girl struggling with her bicycle on a dark country road. By matching these tracks with Inez's first croaking statements, the police obtained a clear picture of what had happened. While she was trying to fix the chain, a white Ford Transit drove up to her and stopped. What happened next? Threats, violence, deception still had to be clarified. But one thing was obvious. This was now no longer just a missing persons case. The police had all the evidence that a vehicle abduction had occurred on this road. And the first task was clear. Find this van and the man at the wheel. However, finding this van and its driver proved to be a tricky task. A white Ford Transit in rural Alentejo is not a needle in a haystack. It is a haystack consisting of many identical white needles. Every second farmer, construction worker, or small business owner here has such a van. It is a workhorse, inconspicuous and ubiquitous. The only clues the police had were the license plate fragments, 56 UH, and that strange detail about the smell of clove tobacco. The routine, yet vital police work began. The detectives submitted a request to the National Vehicle Database for the entire Porto Alegre district. The criteria was simple: brand, Ford, model, transit, color, Branco, white, license plate. Contains the combination 56 UH. The system processed the request for a few seconds, and then a list appeared on the screen. Several dozen hits. This was the first step, eliminating hundreds of other vehicles but still leaving a huge field of work. Next, the second unofficial filter came into play. The detectives began to cross-reference this list through their internal network of informants and local scene connoisseurs. They called colleagues from neighboring precincts, patrol officers who knew their area like the back of their hand. The question was always the same. Which of these owners smokes clove tobacco, or someone in their circle? It was tedious work, relying on rumors, conjectures, and human memory. In parallel, another group of investigators began to scrutinize Inez's own environment. Friends, classmates, colleagues. And almost immediately they encountered the first standard clue: the ex-boyfriend, Tiago, with whom, according to friends, she had a loud argument in front of the school the day before her disappearance. Gradually, step by step, the huge list began to shrink. Someone had an ironclad alibi, another's van had been in the workshop for half a year. Yet another turned out to be a 70-year-old man who hadn't left his village in years. Finally, after several days of sifting through information, 3 files lay on the lead investigator's desk. 3 of the most probable directions for the investigation. The first was Nuno Fee, a mechanic from the bus depot. He owned a white Transit that matched the description, and rumor had it that he did indeed smoke a strange, flavored tobacco. The second was a local scrap dealer nicknamed Zé Pinto. His old van also matched the description, and he himself had a reputation for doing any small job for cash, no questions asked. And the third was that very ex-boyfriend, Tiago. The motive of jealousy has always been one of the strongest. The investigation focused on these 3 names, and now each of them had to be scrutinized. The first person they scrutinized was Nuno V, the mechanic from the bus depot. On paper, he seemed to be the ideal suspect. He had a white Ford Transit that matched the description. Colleagues confirmed that he did indeed smoke an aromatic, clove-scented tobacco. It seemed the case was on the verge of being solved. But as is often the case in complex investigations, the most obvious version crumbled at the first serious review. The investigators did not immediately summon Nuno for questioning. They began by checking his alibi, quietly and discreetly, First, they requested the tachograph data from his work bus. This small device, an impartial witness, records every movement and stop of a commercial vehicle, and it showed that Nuno V was on the night shift at the depot on the evening of the abduction, the 17th of October, from 20 hours, 40 minutes until 23 hours, 10 minutes. He had not left the premises. To confirm this 100%, the detective seized the surveillance camera footage. In the blurry video, Nuno could be clearly seen walking through the workshop in his work clothes, working on a bus engine and drinking coffee with colleagues. He was there, at his workplace, a few kilometers from that dark road where everything happened. The final decisive nail in the coffin of this version, however, was the tire examination. The forensic technicians working at the scene where Inez's bicycle was found had identified a clear tread pattern of summer tires. However, when experts examined Nuno's personal van, they saw that he had already put on winter tires and with a completely different tread pattern. This was irrefutable physical evidence. He could not have been there. Nuno V's file was closed. His name was removed from the list of suspects. The investigation hit its first dead end. The most promising lead was broken, and now investigators had to start fresh with the remaining 2 names on the list, hoping they did not have an equally solid alibi. While one group of detectives ran into a wall with the van owners, another, no less methodically, worked through Inez's own environment. They re-interviewed her friends, classmates, and family, trying to find the smallest clue, the slightest oddity in her life in recent weeks. And right there, in quiet conversations around kitchen tables, not in police databases, a new name emerged: Raphael F. At first glance, he was just a neighbor. A 32-year-old man living in the same area, married with a small child whom Inez sometimes babysat when the parents had to leave. He was part of her usual, safe world. Yet as one of Inez's closest friends recounted, this security had recently cracked. According to her words, Raphael had become too intrusive. His casual encounters at the garden gate turned into outright stalking. His offers to give her a ride became more frequent and insistent, always with the same phrase, "We won't tell anyone." This frightened and annoyed Inez. She had brusquely rebuffed him several times, but he didn't understand. A few days before her disappearance, according to the friend's interrogation protocol, Inez could no longer tolerate it. She told Raphael directly that she would tell his wife everything if he didn't stop. This was a turning point for the investigation. They were no longer facing an abstract madman in a white van. There was a concrete person with a very strong, very understandable motive: fear. The fear of losing his family, his reputation, his usual life. The fear of exposure, which could drive desperate acts. But there was a huge, insurmountable problem. The detectives immediately checked Raphael F. in all databases. He did not own and had never owned a white Ford Transit. He drove an old Opel Corsa. The most important piece of evidence, with which everything had begun, did not match the main suspect at all. The police had a man with a motive, but without the vehicle. It seemed like another dead end. Unless the van wasn't his. This thought, if the van wasn't his, became the key to the puzzle for the investigators. How do you prove that a person used a car that doesn't belong to them? You have to look for traces of a transaction, a contract, a payment. In the modern world, every step leaves a trace, not only on the gravel at the roadside, but also in the digital space. And the detectives decided to check precisely this invisible trail. They submitted an official request for an overview of all financial transactions of Raphael F. for the evening of the 17th of October. When the printout lay on the table at first glance, there seemed to be nothing remarkable about it. The usual expenses of a normal person. But 2 lines, almost at the end of the list, made the investigator sit up and take notice. 2 small money transfers made late in the evening via the MB-Way system popular in Portugal, both with the same mundane note: combustível, fuel. To whom, and more importantly, for what had Rafael actually paid on the night of the abduction? The detectives began to check the recipients. The first transfer, made at 22 hours, 11 minutes for €150, went to the account of a certain Miguel F. A quick check revealed that he was his younger brother. This was strange, but it proved nothing yet. However, the second transfer, made just 2 minutes later, at 22 hours 13 minutes, for €50, brought everything to light. The recipient was Jose P., better known in the area by the nickname Zé Pinto, the same scrap dealer who was on the original suspect list, and who, as the police knew, owned an old white Ford Transit. The picture came together. Suddenly, all the scattered details converged at one point. Rafael, the man with the motive, transfers money to Zé Pinto, the man with the matching vehicle, and to his brother, a possible accomplice. And all this 1.5 hours after Inés disappeared from the dark country road. This could no longer be a coincidence. The money trail connected all 3 directly on the night of the crime. Now, the investigators not only had a suspect, they had an entire criminal scheme. And it was time to pull on the most important thread, and they pulled. The first person the detectives went to was Zé Pinto, the owner of that very van. And this thread proved to be not so strong after all. Zé Pinto was not a hardened criminal. He was a small-time operator who broke down at the first interrogation. He confessed immediately. Yes, on Saturday evening he had lent his van to the Ferreira brothers, Rafael and his younger brother Miguel, for €50. For an hour there and back, as they said. He swore he hadn't known what they needed the vehicle for, and his phone records confirmed that he was at home all night. Zé Pinto was just a helper, a pawn in someone else's game. But he gave the investigators the most important thing: direct confirmation that on that night it was precisely the brothers who were at the wheel of his van. Now the police not only had a motive and a money trail, but also the instrument of the crime itself. But that was not enough. It had to be proven that the brothers had not simply driven the van through the night of Alentejo. Their route had to be reconstructed, every one of their steps on that fateful night. And again, technology helped. On the investigators' table lay scattered fragments of a digital mosaic. A dry summary from the mobile operator, an ordinary receipt from a hardware store, and a blurry, grainy photo from a surveillance camera. Considered individually, nothing special, but together, they told a chilling story. First, the experts examined Inés's phone. They requested connection data from the mobile operator. This is not about wiretapping conversations. It is technical information about which cell towers the phone communicated with in the last hours of its operation. And the data showed a clear route. From the bakery, the phone moved northeast towards the reservoir. The last signal, the last digital breath, was emitted at 21 hours 36 minutes. The tower that picked it up served the area of the Barragem do Maranhão Dam. After this time, the phone disappeared from the network forever. For the investigators, this meant one thing. The perpetrators had disposed of it, thrown it into the water to cover their tracks and make it appear as if Inés had disappeared right there. But that was not all. Remembering the money transfers, analysts began to examine all of Rafael's transactions that evening, and they discovered another one, made after midnight. At 23 hours 2 minutes, his bank card was used at the Bricolage Montemor hardware store. The detectives immediately went there. They seized not only the camera footage, but also the receipts from that evening. And when they found the right receipt, everything finally fell into place. The shopping list contained 3 items: a roll of grey construction tape, a plastic canister, and a large bottle of concentrated chlorine. Chlorine. the same whose smell the paramedics had noticed first, the same that had left chemical burns on Inez's body. This was no longer indirect evidence. It was direct evidence connecting Raphael to the torture in the well. The final touch was the camera footage at the checkout. In the blurry image, two people were clearly visible: Raphael and his younger brother Miguel. They stood at the checkout, calm, ordinary, as if buying light bulbs or a bag of cement, paying for their cruel kit. Now the investigators had a complete, irrefutable digital map of the crime. At 21 hours 36 minutes, they dispose of the phone at the dam. At 22 hours 11 minutes, Raphael transfers money to his brother for the help, and at 22 hours 13 minutes, to Zé Pinto for the van. And at 23 hours 2 minutes, after having already thrown Inez into the well, for some reason, they return to town and buy chlorine and tape. Perhaps the first attempt to tie her up had failed, or they decided to return to finally cover their tracks. Route, time, purchases. Everything fit the logic of the crime. The digital ghosts of their actions lined up into a clear line of accusation. Now, only one thing remained: to present this map to the brothers themselves and wait to see how long they could deny the obvious. But before they presented this digital map to the brothers themselves, the investigators had to do one important thing: finally tie up all loose ends. On the list of suspects, two people formally still remained: Inez's ex-boyfriend Tiago and the owner of the van, Zé Pinto. Any good lawyer would have clung to these names to sow reasonable doubt about his client's guilt. Therefore, the detectives had to close these versions not just with assumptions, but with solid facts. And what if they had indeed overlooked someone? First, they returned to Tiago. The motive of jealousy, the recent argument, all of that looked like a classic. Tiago was summoned for questioning, and although he was nervous, he appeared confident. He recounted that on the evening of Inez's disappearance, he was at a rehearsal with his music group in Portalegre, a city several dozen kilometers from Montfort. This was an easily verifiable statement, and the detectives checked it. They succeeded. At 21 hours, 17 minutes, approximately around the time Inez was abducted on the dark road, Tiago withdrew cash from an ATM in the center of Portalegre. The surveillance camera had captured his face, clear and unmistakable. That was the first alibi. The second was provided by his bandmates. All unanimously confirmed that Tiago had arrived for rehearsal around 9 o'clock in the evening and stayed with them until midnight. They made music, argued about song lyrics, and made plans for a future performance. The digital trail and witness statements left nothing of the jealous ex-boyfriend version. Tiago's file was finally closed. Now only Zé Pinto remained. The matter was more complicated with him, because he was directly involved in the story. His van, his 50 euros. During a renewed interrogation, he was put under greater pressure, and he told everything he knew to save himself. He admitted that Raphael had called him that evening and asked for the van, literally for an hour and a half. He said he needed to transport some old spare parts from an abandoned family farm. Zé Pinto agreed for 50 euros without further questions. He gave them the keys and stayed home. To verify his words, the investigators requested his mobile phone data. And again, technology spoke volumes. All night, while his van was driving around the area, Zé Pinto's phone did not leave the reception area of the cell tower that served his house. This was the decisive argument. Zé Pinto was not at the crime scene. He was an accomplice who, out of greed and stupidity, had provided the instrument of the crime but had not participated in it himself. In the files, his status changed. From a suspect, he became an accessory. The circle was closed. All extraneous versions had been processed and concluded. All false leads led to a dead end. Only one path remained: illuminated by digital receipts, connection data from cell towers, and witness statements. And this path led directly to the home of the brothers Rafael and Miguel Ferreira. There were no more ifs and buts, only them. And when all superfluous figures were removed from the board, only one question remained at the center. Why? Why did Rafael, an ordinary neighbor, husband, and father, have to do something so monstrous? The investigators had a complete map of his actions, but for the court, for the jury, for understanding the whole picture, that was not enough. A motive was needed. Clear, distinct, human, even if in its ugliest form. The answer to this question lay not in digital traces, but in a simple sentence that investigators heard again and again from Inez's best friend. A sentence that was, in essence, her death sentence. During a renewed interrogation, the girl, faltering with tears and guilt for perhaps not having attached importance to it sooner, recalled the exact sentence that Inez had thrown at Rafael literally the day before her disappearance. They met in front of the local shop, and he started again with his inappropriate compliments and offers to give her a ride. Inez, tired of this sticky intrusiveness, interrupted him mid-sentence and looked him directly in the eyes. "One more time, and I'm going to your wife." This threat was not just words for him. It was the trigger held to the temple of his perfectly constructed, albeit false life. In a small, conservative town where everyone keeps an eye on everyone, where reputation is not an abstract concept but how the shopkeeper greets you and whether you get looked at sideways at the school assembly, the exposure of his harassment would have meant immediate and complete collapse. It would have been the end of his marriage, his relationship with his child who saw him as a hero, the end of his neighbor's respect. He imagined the scene in full detail. His wife's cold, uncomprehending face, her questions to which he had no answers, calls to her parents, whispers behind his back on the street. In his panicked consciousness, there was only one way out: to silence her forever before she could make her threat come true. In the files, his motive was formulated in dry legal language, which, however, perfectly captured the essence of what happened: cover-up of another criminal offense and avoidance of shame. Now that the investigators had not only a complete overview of the actions but also a clear understanding of this animal fear that drove the perpetrator, the case was practically closed. It remained only to bring charges and listen to what the brothers themselves had to say. And there they sat in the interrogation room. First, Rafael. He entered with the appearance of injured virtue, sat down opposite the investigator and prepared to play the role of the concerned neighbor who was mistakenly drawn into another's tragedy. He was calm, confident. His body language said, "You're at the wrong address here." His younger brother, Miguel, was waiting in the next room for his questioning, and Rafael was certain that he would stick to the legend they had hastily devised. The interrogation began with a simple procedural question that was supposed to lay the foundation for their alibi. Where were you on Saturday evening, the 17th of October, let's say, between 9 and midnight? Comma, asked the investigator without taking his eyes off Rafael. At home, of course, he answered without the slightest hesitation. With my wife and my son. We watched a movie. You can ask them. He threw what he believed was an unbeatable trump card on the table, an alibi confirmed by the person closest to him. But the investigator didn't even blink. He silently pushed Rafael the printout of bank transactions. Good. Then perhaps you can explain this. The detective's finger pointed to 2 lines. A transfer to Jose Pinto's account at 2213, €50, and another, 2 minutes earlier, to your brother Miguel, €150, both with the note fuel. Rather late transactions for someone sitting at home with his family. The confidence in Rafael's face faded for the first time, but he quickly recovered. That... He acted as if he remembered. Pinto picked up some old metal from me recently. I just paid him back his debts. And my brother. Miguel constantly has money problems. I just helped him with a debt for car parts. Nothing special. That was a lie. A well thought out one, but still a lie. It would have sounded credible if not for the next piece of evidence the investigator placed on the table. A photo, a grainy but clear image from the surveillance camera at the checkout of the hardware store, Bricolage Montemor. And this is probably also part of your family evening. The investigator's voice became sharper. Time, 23:02. You and your brother Miguel. You're buying something. What did you need so late in the evening, Rafael? Rafael stared at the photo. He hadn't expected this. He was silent for several seconds, feverishly thinking of a new explanation. We jumped out for half an hour. We remembered that we needed something for the bathroom repair. My wife can confirm that. For a repair, then? The investigator let the word hang in the air and then slowly, as if playing the last card, placed the receipt on the table. Then let's look at your repair kit. A roll of grey construction tape, a plastic canister, and a large bottle of concentrated chlorine. Tell me, Rafael, what kind of repair were you planning to carry out with this set at 11 o'clock in the evening? There was silence in the room. Rafael looked at the receipt, and there was no more confidence or calm in his face. Only the hunted, panicked look of a man whose lie had crumbled to dust under the weight of irrefutable digital evidence. He fell silent. The interrogation of his brother Miguel was shorter and simpler. He was Rafael's shadow, a follower, not a leader. He tried clumsily to repeat the memorized version of staying at home, but when the same evidence was presented to him one after another, transfers, photo, receipt, he simply collapsed. He didn't confess directly, but began to get tangled in contradictions, contradict himself, and finally fell silent with his head lowered. The detectives didn't get a direct confession that day. Neither of the brothers said, "Yes, it was me." But that was no longer necessary. Their version of events was torn to shreds. Their clumsy attempts at justification in the face of ironclad digital traces seemed pitiful and incredible. They had locked themselves in their lie, and now the key to this door lay in the hands of the prosecutor. The key to this door, locked with lies, indeed lay in the hands of the prosecutor. And this key was not only forged from digital data. While the Ferreira brothers were building their clumsy defense in the interrogation rooms, the forensic technicians were working with evidence that could not be explained by debts or spontaneous repairs. They worked with the physical world which, unlike people, never lies. And precisely there, in the dirt and dust, they found what was to be the last nail in the coffin of their defense. The first object of detailed examination was that very white delivery van of Zé Pinto. After its owner's interrogation, the vehicle was brought to a forensic garage and literally dismantled centimeter by centimeter. It was an old workhorse, full of garbage, dust, and the smell of cheap diesel. But even through this bouquet, the experienced nose of an expert smelled a barely perceptible but persistent chlorine note. That was the first confirmation. Then began the most painstaking phase: collecting microparticles. Experts in white overalls vacuumed every corner of the cargo area with special equipment. Among hundreds of dust, dirt, and rust samples, some tiny blue fibers caught their attention, barely visible to the naked eye. These fibers were immediately sent to the laboratory. The police still kept the clothes in which Inez was found, including the remains of her dark blue sweater. A few hours later came the expected answer. Spectral analysis showed the microfibers from the van were absolutely identical in composition, color, and structure to the fibers from Inez's sweater. That was it. Direct physical proof that she, or at least her clothing, had been in this van. But that wasn't all. In parallel, another group of forensic technicians was working at the crime scene. at that very abandoned quinta with the stone well. The area was damp from recent rains. The ground had turned into sticky mud. And right at the edge of the well, where someone must have stood to first throw the girl down and then cover the shaft with the heavy grating and pallet, they found it. A single but perfectly clear shoe print. The print was immediately sent for examination. It was a cheap work shoe of size 41, a popular model called Obra. Such a find said little by itself. There are thousands of similar shoes in the area. But now the investigators had a search warrant for the Ferreira brothers' houses. And in the younger one's house, Miguel's, they found in the entrance closet a pair of exactly such shoes. Dirty, with traces of damp earth. They were sent to the same laboratory. The experts compared the sole of Miguel's shoe with the print made at the well. The profile matched perfectly. But the forensic technicians went further. They examined the microscopic defects on the sole, tiny scratches from stones, wear marks, the unique abrasion pattern that forms with each person's walking. It was like a fingerprint, and it matched. There was no doubt. It was exactly Miguel Ferreira who stood at the edge of this well on the night when Inés was thrown in there. Digital traces could perhaps be challenged, but the print of one's own shoe in the mud at the crime scene, that no longer. And they didn't use this print as evidence for court, but as a battering ram to break through the wall of silence. Miguel Ferreira was brought again to the same interrogation room. But this time the atmosphere was different. There were no more long pauses and suggestive questions. On the table in front of him lay not a recorder but a folder with the forensic examination report. The investigator opened it silently and pushed it toward Miguel. Inside were photographs. A close-up of the print in the mud at the well, a macro shot of the sole of his own shoe, and diagrams where matching scratches and wear marks were marked with red lines. It was visual, irrefutable, and absolutely comprehensible even without legal training. The detective only said, "This is your shoe." At the crime scene. Explain that. Miguel stared at these photos and his world collapsed right there, under the light of the cold lamp. He looked at them for 1 minute, 2, 5. There was such silence in the room that you could hear the hum of the ventilation. His older brother was smarter, more cunning. He could have thought up some lie. But Miguel was not like that. He was just an executor, a follower. And now, alone with this irrefutable evidence, he collapsed. He raised his gaze to the investigator and his shoulders sank powerlessly. He gave up. After a long, heavy pause, he began to speak. First quietly, almost whispering, but then more and more confidently as if a dam had burst. His words, recorded in the protocol, were a complete and unconditional confession. "It was Raphael's idea," he began, trying to shift as much guilt as possible onto his brother. He hadn't been himself in recent days. He said this girl would destroy his life, his family. He said we just needed to intimidate her, scare her so much that she would be silent. I swear I didn't want this. He said he had thought everything through. I only helped drive the car and hold her down. And he began to tell, in details that only a participant could know, how Raphael called him that Saturday and said that we must act today. How they took Zé Pinto's van under the pretext of needing to transport spare parts. How they waited for Inés at the bakery and followed her. When they saw that her chain had come off, Raphael said, "That's a sign." He described how Raphael got out of the car, how he grabbed Inés, how she tried to scream, but he covered her mouth. How the two of them dragged her into the van's cargo area and tied her hands with the construction tape that Raphael had bought beforehand. He told how they drove to their grandfather's old, abandoned farm, because no one ever goes there. The most terrible part was his account of what happened at the well. He claimed that Inés had been unconscious after a blow to the head in the van. She wasn't moving, he repeated several times, as if this would free him from part of the guilt. He described how Raphael pushed aside the heavy grating and wooden pallet, how the two of them took her, one at the shoulders, the other at the legs, and simply threw her down. He even remembered the dull splash of water in the darkness. And then his brother said, "There. Now she will be silent." His monologue lasted over an hour. He also told about how they got rid of her phone at the dam and about the trip to the hardware store to buy chlorine. Raphael suddenly panicked that they had left traces and decided to treat the well. It was a complete, comprehensive confession. The investigators' version, so painstakingly assembled from digital and physical evidence, was completely confirmed from within. Now it was no longer just the prosecution's theory. It was proven truth. And this proven truth turned out to be more terrible than any fiction. Based on Miguel's confession and Inez's own testimony, the investigators could reconstruct what happened in those terrible hours when she was at the bottom of the well. And this reconstruction of events explained how she had managed to accomplish the impossible. When the brothers threw her into the darkness, they were certain that she was either already unconscious or would not survive long in the ice-cold water. For them, the matter was settled. They covered the well with a rusty grating, placed a heavy wooden pallet on top, and secured it with a boulder for safety. Problem solved. They drove away and left her to die. But Inez was alive. The first hours were hell. Darkness, slime on the walls, cold that went to the bone, and the sound of dripping water that drove one to madness. And then she heard a motor roaring above again. Hope mixed with horror. They were back, but not to rescue, but to finish what they had started. When the chlorine flowed down, burning her skin and her lungs, she understood that they would stop at nothing. It seemed to them that it had become quiet, and they drove away a second time, this time in absolute certainty of their impunity. And then happened what they could not have foreseen. On the second day, it began to rain. First fine drizzle, then a heavy shower, typical for the Portuguese autumn. And the water level in the well began to rise slowly but inexorably. This was both curse and blessing. The water threatened to drown her, but it also lifted her higher and higher, centimeter by centimeter, reducing the distance to salvation. While she groped with her hands on the slippery stone walls for some hold, her fingers struck something hard and metallic. It was an old cast-iron pin driven into the masonry, all that remained of a long rotted ladder. She clung to it and tried to pull herself up, but her numbed hands slipped off. Then came an idea as ingenious as it was simple. She began to tear her soaked sweater into long strips. By wrapping these around her hands, she obtained improvised gloves that gave her the necessary grip. Now she had a plan. With the rising water, she could reach the first pin. After fixing her feet and hands on it, she felt for the second, about half a meter higher. A jerk, pain in the cramped muscles, the grinding of wet fabric on rusty metal. She reached the second. Now it was only a few centimeters to the pallet that blocked the exit. She braced herself against it with shoulder and back and used the buoyancy of the water like a jack. The pallet was heavy, soaked with moisture. It barely gave way. First attempt, second. On the third attempt, with a desperate, hoarse cry, she could move it a few centimeters. A grinding sound was heard. Through the gap that formed, fresh, cold night air streamed in. That was enough. With her last strength, she pushed it away and climbed out. The story of her survival, reconstructed minute by minute, ceased to be a miracle. It was a chain of events. The fatal error of the perpetrators who had not convinced themselves of her death, the saving rain, and above all the incredible will to live of Inez herself. This story became the main charge in the upcoming trial. And this story became the main charge read before the jury court of the city of Porto Alegre. In the dock sat 3 men: Rafael Ferreira, his brother Miguel, and the scrap dealer Zé Pinto. The entire city followed the trial with bated breath, asking themselves one question: what punishment can be appropriate for what they have done? The trial was short. The prosecutor methodically presented one piece of evidence after another: connection data, receipts, video recordings, the fiber analysis, and of course, the shoe print. The strongest moment was the testimony of Inés herself. She spoke quietly. Her voice was still damaged, but every word sounded in the deathly silence of the hall like a hammer blow. When Miguel's confession was then read in court, the jurors had no more doubts. The verdict was unanimous: guilty on all charges. The judge read the verdict. Rafael Ferreira received the maximum sentence as organizer and main perpetrator: 23 years imprisonment. His younger brother, Miguel, whose confession was considered a mitigating circumstance, was sentenced to 18 years. Zé Pinto, who had provided the van for €50, received 2 years probation for complicity. Justice had prevailed. Justice had prevailed. But a legal conclusion is not the end of a human story. For all those affected by this tragedy, life after the verdict could never be the same again. The consequences of a single terrible decision, made from fear and shame, spread like waves in water and irreversibly changed fates. The main character of this epilogue was naturally Inés herself. She faced a long and painful path of rehabilitation, not only physically, to heal her injured throat and treat the chemical burns, but also psychologically, to learn again to trust the world and to fall asleep without nightmares of ice-cold water and the smell of chlorine. Soon her family made a difficult but only right decision. They sold their house in Montfort and moved away. The town that was once their home had become a place where every street corner, every old well on an abandoned farm reminded them of the terror experienced. They had to start from scratch, far from curious glances and painful memories. But the waves of this crime did not affect only her. Rafael's wife, the woman whose name he had so feared to drag through the mud, immediately filed for divorce after his arrest. Her world had collapsed overnight, leaving her alone with a child and a surname that had now become synonymous with cruelty in their small community. She had to bear this cross alone and one day explain to her son why his father would never return home. That abandoned farm too, the silent witness to the crime, did not remain long in the possession of the Ferreira family. The relatives who could not bear this burden of shame sold it as quickly as possible to erase this dark spot from their history. But the well, an old stone scar on the face of the earth, remained in its place. The case was officially closed and transferred to the archive of the Porto Alegre district. But for the people whose names were written on its pages, it will never end. The verdict put a period under the investigation, but it could not undo what had happened and heal all the wounds that this crime had left in people's souls.